There's a moment right before something impossible happens, where the air goes completely still. Not quiet, not calm, still, like the universe itself is holding its breath. I've been a trial observer for 11 years. I've watched candidates from 47 different species attempt the Gareth qualification trials. I've seen Kreth warriors with bones like compressed titanium collapse on the 4th stage. I've seen Veldrani psychics, beings who can feel seismic shifts 3 kilometers underground, curl into themselves and refuse to continue. I've watched the Dorvan, the most physically resilient species in the eastern spiral arm, tap out before the halfway mark. I've seen a lot of things fail. But I had never, not once in 11 years, seen a human even attempt the Gareth trial. Until the morning specialist Mara Voss walked through the intake gate at station Kelith 7, dropped her duffel bag on the floor, looked at the 40-meter-high steel monolith of the trial architecture, and said, very quietly, "Okay, let's see it then. Let me back up. The Gareth qualification trials exist because someone, 300 years ago, a Veldun admiral named Gareth Fuzz, decided that the Galactic Defense Initiative needed a better way to sort its soldiers. Not just by species capability, not by physical strength or combat scores or how well you performed in a simulation. He wanted to know what you did when everything was against you. So he built a trial system that adapted, that learned what broke you. And then it put that thing in front of you, over and over, in every possible combination, until either you passed or you broke. The Gareth trial has a completion rate of 4.3%. That number is not an accident, it is not a flaw, it is a design feature. Gareth Fuzz believed that 4.3% was the natural percentage of beings in any population who could function under conditions of true, sustained, cascading failure. The rest, and he said this without cruelty, more like a biologist noting a fact, the rest were built for other things. The trial runs across 7 stages. Each stage is designed around the candidate's physiological and psychological profile, which is assembled during a 72-hour intake assessment before the trial begins. The architecture of the trial literally shifts to create the hardest possible version of each challenge for each individual candidate. Which is why, when Mara Voss submitted her application and the intake system processed her biological profile, the trial administrators had a problem. The system didn't know what to do with her. I was in the observation deck when intake director Thesson Vor called the assessment team together. He's a Kreth, tall, gray-plated, the kind of being who looks like he was carved out of a cliff face and then taught to talk. He's been running intake at Kelith 7 for 30 years. I've never seen him look uncertain. He looked uncertain. The adaptive matrix, he said, pulling up the profiling data on the central display, has flagged the human candidate as an anomaly. In what way? Asked Praxis, the Veldrani neural analyst. In the sense that it cannot establish a reliable breakpoint profile. Silence. Every candidate who enters the Gareth trial gets a breakpoint profile. It's the thing the system uses to calibrate the trial. The system identifies your psychological fault lines, the specific combinations of physical stress, environmental pressure, cognitive overload, and emotional trigger that will push you past your ability to function. And then it designs the trial around those fault lines. No breakpoint profile means the system can't calibrate. It ran the assessment 3 times, Thesson said. The human's physiological resilience markers are inconsistent with her species classification. Meaning? Praxis asked. Thesson pulled up the chart. Meaning her pain tolerance registers in the upper range of what the system associates with heavy gravity species. Her cortisol response under sustained stress shows a pattern the system has only previously recorded in beings who have experienced long-term trauma conditioning. Her cognitive function under sleep deprivation shows almost no degradation until hour 47, and her psychological breakpoint indicators. He paused. "They're not there," he said. "Or rather, they're there, but they keep moving. Every time the assessment establishes a likely fault line, the human's response pattern shifts. The system cannot pin it down long enough to build a trial around it." I wrote all of this down in my observation log. Then I wrote, "This is either going to be the shortest trial I've ever observed, or something I've never seen before." I met Mara Voss on the morning of day 1, before the trial began. Observer access to candidates is limited, but the pre-trial observation window is open, and I was watching from the viewing gallery when she came into the preparation chamber. She was, and I want to be precise here because I've thought about this a lot since, entirely ordinary to look at. That was the first thing. Medium height. Brown hair pulled back in a way that suggested practicality rather than care. She wasn't built like a Kreth warrior or a Dorvan combatant. She was just a person. A young human woman in a gray candidate uniform, carrying a small pouch of personal items that the trial rules allowed. She sat down in the preparation chamber and she didn't pace. She didn't stretch. She didn't do any of the things most candidates do in those final minutes, the rituals, the meditations, the fear management routines. She ate a nutrition bar. Slowly, like she was actually tasting it. Then she looked up at the ceiling. The trial architecture rose above the preparation chamber like a cathedral of steel and mechanism, 40 meters of vertical challenge stages disappearing into artificial mist, and she just looked at it for a long time. I couldn't read her expression from where I was sitting. Later, when I reviewed the preparation chamber footage, I could see it more clearly. She wasn't afraid. She also wasn't calm in the way that trained beings are calm, the practiced stillness, the meditative blankness. She was calm in the way that someone is calm when they've already accepted the worst-case scenario, when the outcome is no longer the thing they're holding onto. One of the other observers, a Veldrani named Sethek, leaned over to me as we watched. "She's going to tap out in stage 2, he said. "The atmospheric pressure stage is calibrated for her lung capacity. The system will create a sustained hypoxic environment. Humans don't handle hypoxia well." "The system couldn't establish her breakpoint profile," I reminded him. "So it will default to species standard parameters," he said, "which are not favorable for her." I watched Mara finish her nutrition bar, fold the wrapper carefully, and put it in her pocket. "We'll see," I said. Stage 1, the pressure maze. The trial begins at 600. The pressure maze is the opening stage of the Gareth trial, not because it's easy, but because it's the calibration stage. The trial architecture uses your performance in the maze to finalize the parameters for everything that follows. How you move through the maze, your pace, your decision patterns, your physical responses to the environmental variables, feeds into the adaptive system in real time. The maze itself is a three-dimensional structure roughly the size of a city block. It has no fixed path. The walls shift. The floor angles. Sections can go vertical. The atmospheric pressure changes every 90 seconds. The lighting moves on an unpredictable cycle, shifting from full visibility to near blackout to harsh strobing. Most candidates who pass stage 1 do so in somewhere between 4 and 7 hours. The record is 3 hours and 11 minutes, set by a Kreth named Vethgaren 6 years ago. He used his species pressure wave echolocation to map the maze even in blackout conditions, and his natural atmospheric tolerance let him power through the pressure variations without physiological stress. Mara entered the maze at 6:01. At 6:04, the first wall shift occurred. We watched on the observation feeds as the corridor she was moving through reconfigured. A section of floor rotated 45 degrees, and 2 walls compressed inward by roughly 30%. She stopped. She pressed one hand against the nearest wall, waited maybe 3 seconds. Then she took a slightly different angle on the compressed corridor and moved through it. I noted this. She felt for the movement. She didn't react to it, she waited for information before deciding. At 6:20, the lights went to near blackout. Most candidates stop when this happens. They slow down, orient themselves, try to find a reference point. Some species have sensory adaptations that help. Veldrani can read thermal gradients. Dorvan have magnetoreception. Humans have none of these. Mara stopped too. For about 4 seconds. Then she started moving again. Same pace, not faster, not slower. Sethek beside me made a sound that I've learned to translate as skeptical curiosity. She's moving blind, he said. She's going to walk into a wall. She did not walk into a wall. What she did, and this only became clear when I reviewed the footage at quarter speed later, was switch her weight distribution. In the blackout sections, she moved her center of gravity lower, slightly wider stance, and she slowed her footfalls just enough that the tactile feedback from each step was informative. She was reading the floor, not with any alien sensory ability, just with her feet and attention, and whatever internal model she was building of the maze's behavior patterns. It took her 6 hours and 48 minutes to complete stage 1. That's not fast. It wasn't meant to be impressive, but the completion rate for stage 1 among all species combined is about 60%, meaning 4 in 10 candidates don't make it out of the opening maze. And when I cross-referenced her path choices against the maze's adaptive responses, I found something that took me a while to understand. The maze had tried to reconfigure around her 3 times in ways designed to create dead ends from her current position. Standard technique. The adaptive system identifies your movement pattern and engineers a trap. All 3 times, she had changed her movement pattern before the trap closed. She wasn't countering the maze's strategy. She didn't have enough data to know the maze had a strategy. She was just restless, variable. She didn't move the same way twice if she could help it. And because the maze's adaptive system was trying to track a pattern that kept shifting, it kept building traps for a version of her that wasn't quite where she was anymore. I'm not sure she knew she was doing it, but I wrote it down anyway. Stage 2, atmospheric descent. Sethek had been right about one thing. Stage 2 was going to be hard for her. The atmospheric descent chamber is exactly what it sounds like. A sealed vertical shaft, roughly 30 meters deep, where the air pressure and oxygen concentration are reduced in controlled increments as the candidate descends. At the bottom of the shaft, there's an exit hatch, but to reach it, you have to solve a mechanical puzzle that becomes progressively more complex the longer you take, because the hypoxic environment degrades cognitive function over time. The puzzle at the bottom is calibrated to require approximately 12 to 15 minutes of focused cognitive work under normal conditions. Under hypoxic conditions, for most species, it takes longer, sometimes much longer. The chamber is designed so that if you spend more than 40 minutes at the bottom, the oxygen concentration drops to a level where cognitive function degrades faster than you can compensate. It's a race between your brain and your body's failure. For species with high baseline oxygen efficiency, Kreth, Dorvan, some of the heavy gravity species, stage 2 is difficult but manageable. For species with lower oxygen tolerance, it's the most common failure point in the entire trial. Humans are not known for high oxygen efficiency. I watched Mara stand at the top of the descent shaft and look down. The shaft was lit from below, a faint amber glow that made the bottom look very far away. She took a long breath, then another. Then she started descending. The shaft has rungs on the interior wall. You climb down rather than rappel, which is deliberate, because the upper body effort accelerates oxygen consumption. At about the 10-meter mark, I could see her movement change. The slight roughness that comes with the onset of mild hypoxia. Movements lose their smooth precision. Everything becomes a little more effortful. She slowed down. This is counterintuitive, Most candidates push harder when they feel themselves slowing, trying to compensate for the cognitive degradation with speed. Mara did the opposite. She slowed down and seemed to become more deliberate, each rung grip careful, each foot placement considered. At 15 meters, she stopped entirely for about 30 seconds, just hung there on the rungs. Then she continued. When she reached the bottom of the shaft, the clock showed she'd taken 14 minutes to descend. Slow, but not catastrophically so. Her oxygen consumption would be lower than a candidate who'd rushed. The puzzle at the bottom is a mechanical sequence, a combination of interlocking panels, pressure-sensitive plates, and reconfiguring gear mechanisms. It's not designed to be solved through raw intelligence. It's designed to be solved through sustained attention under pressure. You have to hold a mental model of how the pieces fit together even as your cognitive function is being eroded by oxygen deprivation. I've seen highly intelligent candidates, including one Veldrani candidate whose processing speed was off the charts, fail this puzzle because intelligence and sustained attention under physiological stress are not the same thing. Mara sat down in front of the puzzle. And then she did something I'd never seen a candidate do. She put her hands in her lap. She just looked at it. For a full 2 minutes she didn't touch it, she just looked. Sethek next to me was growing increasingly agitated. She's losing time, the oxygen window. She's mapping it, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure why I said it. Then she reached out and started moving pieces. She was slow. Noticeably slow, the hypoxia was affecting her motor control, you could see it, but her choices were precise. Every piece she moved was intentional. She didn't backtrack. She didn't try combinations and discard them. She moved things in a sequence that, watching it in real time, looked almost like she knew the answer before she started. She solved the puzzle in 9 minutes and 42 seconds. That's the fastest stage 2 puzzle solve in the history of the Gareth trial. The previous record was held by a Veldrani candidate with neural processing abilities that are, by any reasonable standard, superhuman. He'd solved it in 11 minutes and 8 seconds. Mara Voss solved it in 9 minutes and 42 seconds while experiencing moderate hypoxia, without any unusual cognitive enhancements, using methods that the post-trial analysis team later described as spatially intuitive pattern recognition under stress. She climbed out of the shaft, sat on the floor of the transition chamber for about 40 seconds, breathed. Then she stood up and looked at the entrance to stage 3. "Okay," she said, to no one in particular. Stage 3, the collapse field. Word was spreading through the observer deck. I could feel it, that low-frequency shift in attention that happens when a crowd realizes something unusual is occurring. Observers who had been monitoring other candidates in earlier trial runs started drifting to the feeds focused on Mara. The observation gallery, which had been mostly quiet at the start of the day, was filling up. Thesson Vor came to stand near me. He didn't say anything for a while, he just watched. Stage 3 is the one that breaks the most people psychologically. Not physically, the collapse field doesn't injure candidates, but it does something that many beings find harder to survive than physical pain. It removes certainty. The collapse field is an environmental chamber where the physical rules of the space are unreliable. Gravity fluctuates not randomly, but in ways that are just regular enough to suggest a pattern and just irregular enough to make any pattern you identify eventually wrong. The surfaces, floor, walls, ceiling, can switch functions. What looks like a floor can become a ceiling. The room itself doesn't change, your relationship to it does. The goal of stage 3 is to navigate from one end of the chamber to the other. That's it. No puzzle, no combat, no environmental hazard beyond the gravity fluctuation. Just traverse the space. The psychological difficulty is that every instinct you have about how space works gets systematically dismantled. Your sense of up and down becomes unreliable. Your spatial memory, the model you've been building of your environment, keeps getting invalidated. And the chamber is silent except for the sounds you make yourself, which means there's no external reference to anchor you. Most species have some hardwired spatial orientation system, a biological compass, an inner ear mechanism, a magnetoreceptive sense. The collapse field is specifically calibrated to interfere with these systems. Humans have an inner ear. The collapse field was going to make it lie to her. Stage 3 failure rate is about 70% among candidates who make it this far, Thesson said, to no one in particular. I know, I said. The spatial disorientation in humans is expected to be severe. Your inner ear vestibular system is highly dependent on gravity consistency. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. She solved the stage 2 puzzle faster than any recorded candidate. Yes, that shouldn't be possible for a human under hypoxic conditions. No, I said, it probably shouldn't. He didn't say anything else. We both watched. Mara entered the collapse field at 1347. The gravity fluctuation began at 1347.30. I watched her stumble. The first shift was a reduction to roughly 0.4 g. She went too high on a step and had to catch herself on the wall. Then a spike back to 1.2 g dropped her onto one knee. She knelt there for a second. Then she did something that I found difficult to explain in my observation notes, until I talked to a human physiologist 3 weeks later. She closed her eyes. She closed her eyes and she went still, and I'm using the physiologist's description here, ran a deliberate recalibration of her vestibular reference system, which is a technical way of saying she stopped trusting her sense of up and down entirely and shifted her navigation to tactile and proprioceptive feedback. Pressure on her knees, feeling of the surface under her hands. What was in contact with her body and how, not what her inner ear was telling her. She was essentially navigating like a blind person in an unreliable gravity field. It was agonizingly slow. She crawled for parts of it. She pressed herself against surfaces and felt for changes in pressure that would tell her which way the field was pulling before she committed to a movement. She fell twice more, once badly enough that I saw her grab her left wrist and hold it for a moment before continuing. Post-trial medical, a minor sprain. She didn't stop. It took her 4 hours and 20 minutes. The observer gallery was completely silent for most of it. When she emerged from the other end of stage 3, she sat on the floor of the transition corridor and she was visibly shaking. Not dramatic shaking, fine motor tremors, the kind that come after sustained physical and neurological effort. She pressed her hands flat against the floor. Then she laughed, just briefly, a short, exhausted sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, something in between. All right, she said, still to no one. Stage 4, the long dark. Stage 4 begins what the trial administrators call the attrition phase. The first 3 stages test capability. Stage 4 tests endurance. The long dark is a 72-hour isolation and deprivation sequence. No light, no external sound, no companionship. Temperature fluctuates between uncomfortable cold and uncomfortable heat on an unpredictable cycle. Food and water are provided, but only through a dispensary system that releases them on an irregular schedule. Sometimes the candidate has waited 6 hours between water allotments. The purpose of the long dark is to find out what happens to you when there's nothing to focus on but yourself. This is where it gets philosophical, and I don't mean that lightly. The Gareth trial's designers understood something that most military assessment systems overlook. The greatest enemy in sustained field operations is often not the enemy. It's the space inside your own head when there's nothing to do and no way to know when something will be required of you again. The long dark has a 65% failure rate. Candidates tap out for many reasons: hallucinations, very common across most species. Panic responses triggered by the sensory deprivation. Emotional crisis. Disorientation severe enough to produce physical illness. Some candidates simply decide, after 20 or 30 hours of darkness, that whatever the trial is offering on the other side is not worth this. The trial rules allow candidates to tap out at any point during the long dark. They just have to say, "I yield," 3 times in succession. Mara went in at 18:23 on day 1. Observer protocol during stage 4 is limited. We don't watch the candidate directly to preserve the integrity of the deprivation environment. But the chamber has biometric monitoring, and we receive that data in real time. I stayed on the observer deck for most of those 72 hours. I'm not entirely sure why. I'd never done that before, not for any candidate. I usually go home and come back for stage 5. I stayed. Her biometrics were strange. Not dangerous. Medically she was fine throughout, but strange. Her cortisol levels, which spike sharply in most candidates during the long dark and stay elevated, rose for the first 8 hours and then plateaued. They didn't drop to normal, but they didn't continue climbing. They found a level and held. Her heart rate did the same thing. At around hour 20, I expected to see the markers that indicate the onset of hallucination or significant psychological distress. They didn't appear. At hour 36, her biometrics showed she was sleeping. 7 hours of apparently restful sleep in an isolation chamber. At hour 54, the feed showed a slight elevated activity signature, increased heart rate, muscle movement, that the system flagged as possible distress. I watched the flag for 40 minutes before it resolved. Her biometrics returned to baseline. Later, she told me what happened at hour 54. She'd been doing math problems in her head. Long division, then multiplication of increasingly large numbers. When she got to a problem she couldn't hold all the variables for in working memory, it frustrated her enough that her heart rate went up. Then she switched to reciting things she had memorized. She described it as long strings of words I'd learned for no particular reason. Poetry, song lyrics, a list of all the geological eras in order, the periodic table. The full text of something she described as a manual for a machine that doesn't exist anymore. I had a lot of storage to dig through, she told me later. I figured I might as well use it. She came out of the long dark at hour 72 exactly. She hadn't tapped out. She hadn't come close to tapping out, at least not based on what the biometrics showed. She was blinking in the transition corridor light, slightly squinting, moving carefully in the way that bodies move after 72 hours of sensory uncertainty. Thesson was in the observer gallery. He'd come in for stage 4's conclusion. "Is this normal?" I asked him, "for any species?" "No," he said, "it is not." Stage 5, the gauntlet. Stage 5 is the one people think of when they think of the Gareth trial. It's the one with the death statistics. Not actual death, the trial has safety protocols. No candidate has died in over 100 years of operation. But stage 5 is where the trial architecture shifts from environmental and psychological challenge into direct opposition. There are combatants. Not random combatants. The trial system deploys opponents calibrated to each candidate's specific combat profile. It knows what you're good at. It fights you with something you're not good at countering. The gauntlet is a shifting arena, a three-dimensional combat environment that reconfigures every 8 minutes, forcing the fighting to continuously recontextualize. There are no rounds, no breaks. You fight until either you tap out or you've defeated all opponent waves. The number of waves scales with your performance. Fight well, face more opponents. Fight poorly, the system reduces the opposition to a level where you can survive, but not pass. To pass stage 5, you have to achieve a performance threshold that the trial system considers tactically sufficient. It's not about winning every fight. It's about demonstrating that your tactical function doesn't degrade past a certain point under sustained combat pressure. Mara had no formal combat specialization on record. Her military file, I requested access for observation purposes, listed her as a systems specialist, field operations. Some combat training, not a fighter by classification. The gauntlet trial for her was going to be built around her combat weaknesses. I expected something difficult to watch. I'd seen candidates, genuine warriors, decorated soldiers break in Stage 5. The arena reconfigured at 700 on Day 3. The first wave of combatants deployed at 7:01. They were Dorvan soldier drones. The trial used combat standard units, not living fighters calibrated for suppression tactics. Heavy, slow, high damage output, designed to catch and hold rather than pursue. For a candidate with limited combat training, the expected approach is to try to evade, wear out, find vulnerabilities in the drone's programming. For most candidates, that works for a wave or two before the system adapts. Mara looked at the first drone for about 3 seconds. Then she did something that made several people in the observation gallery physically react, a collective intake of breath, a few quiet sounds of surprise. She ran toward it. Not in a combat rush. In a specific, diagonal line that took her inside the drone's optimal engagement range before it could recalibrate its threat assessment. She didn't have the strength to damage a Dorvan drone with direct impact. She clearly knew this. What she did instead was climb it. She got her hands on the upper chassis and used the momentum of her approach to get above the drone's sensor cluster. And then, she did something to the back of its neck that I had to have a mechanical analyst explain to me later. She found the manual override coupling, the physical emergency shutoff that exists on all combat drones for safety maintenance. She engaged it. The drone shut down. The maintenance coupling is not a feature that appears in any standard combat training database. It's in the technical documentation for the drone models, the kind of thing a systems specialist might know. The kind of thing that would never occur to a trained fighter because trained fighters are not, by instinct, looking for the maintenance manual when they're in a fight. Mara Voss, in the first 40 seconds of Stage 5, found the factory shutoff on a combat drone by using knowledge she wasn't supposed to have in this context. The gallery was making noise now. I could hear conversations starting up behind me. The second wave adapted, as the system always does. Different drone configuration, this one designed to stay out of close range. Ranged suppression weapons. Environmental advantages. The arena reconfigured to provide cover positions that favored the drone's range advantage. She moved through the arena differently now. Faster, more unpredictable in her path, not random, but with the same quality I'd noticed in the Stage 1 maze. She never moved the same way twice. She gave the drone's targeting system a problem that kept changing shape. She found a section of the arena reconfiguration that created a temporary structural vulnerability, a corner where the shifting walls would predictably pass through each other for approximately 2 seconds before locking. She used that 2-second window to be somewhere the drone couldn't follow. She spent 11 minutes basically playing hide and locate with a combat drone. It was not graceful. She got hit twice. The observation system flagged them as non-lethal but clearly uncomfortable impact events. She didn't stop. At minute 12, she found the second drone's antenna cluster exposed during an arena reconfiguration sequence and disabled its targeting function, with what the analysis team later identified as a piece of the arena floor that she had loosened during the previous configuration. It took her most of the day. 7 waves. She did not beat all 7 in conventional combat terms. She beat 3 through finding technical vulnerabilities. She beat 2 by using the arena against the opponent, environmental tactics, using the reconfiguration to create situations the drones weren't programmed to navigate. one she avoided entirely through a sustained maneuvering pattern that the system eventually scored as effective tactical withdrawal with maintained objective capability, which is trial language for she survived it long enough that the wave ended. One got her down to the floor. The post-trial medical report would note 3 cracked ribs from that one. She was on the arena floor, combat drone standing over her, and the trial safety protocol was a half-second from triggering an automatic end. She said something. I couldn't hear it from the gallery. The audio pickup on the floor was poor. She told me later that she said, "Not today." Then she found the drone's weight distribution weakness. Every combat drone has one. They're designed for bipedal or multi-limbed species with specific mass distribution assumptions. She shifted the drone's center of gravity by bracing her legs against its lower chassis and pushing while pulling on its arm joint. It went over. She crawled on top of it and reached the manual coupling before it could right itself. She completed stage 5. The gallery sounded like nothing I had ever heard in 11 years of trial observation. Stage 6, the mirror. Stage 6 is classified. Even observers with my level of clearance only see limited data from stage 6. I know what it's designed to do. I don't know exactly what it shows each candidate. It's the most personal stage, and the trial architects guard its specifics carefully. What I can tell you is that stage 6 uses the psychological profile assembled during intake and updated continuously throughout the trial to confront the candidate with what it has identified as their deepest source of fear or doubt. Not their stated fears, their structural ones, the thing that under sufficient pressure would make them stop. The thing that makes you feel like maybe you shouldn't be here, like maybe you're wrong about yourself. Like maybe all of this is evidence of foolishness rather than capability. Stage 6 failure rate is 89% of candidates who reach it. Mara was in stage 6 for 6 hours. I have no data on what she experienced. The system's output is sealed. What I can tell you is what the biometrics showed. She went in. Her cortisol spiked immediately and significantly. Her heart rate elevated to a level the medical monitor flagged as high but not medically concerning. And then, over the next 3 hours, both slowly, unevenly, but genuinely declined. Not to baseline, not to calm, but down. Whatever the mirror showed her, she didn't solve it. I don't think stage 6 is designed to be solved. I think it's designed to be stayed with, to be in the room with the hardest version of your own doubt and not leave. She stayed. She came out of stage 6 at 2200. She looked different. I'm not sure how to describe it. Not harder, more settled. Like something that had been held at a particular tension had been allowed to release to a lower level. Still present, still in it, but something resolved. She didn't say anything in the transition corridor. She just sat down, drank the water that the stage transition dispenser provided, and stared at the floor. Then she looked up at the entry to stage 7. She looked at it for a long time. Then she lay down on the transition corridor floor and went to sleep. Stage 7, the end. Stage 7 is the Gareth trial's final argument. Everything before it was individual stages with individual demands. Stage 7 combines them all simultaneously. Or rather, it builds a scenario that requires everything the previous 6 stages have tested, all at once, in a dynamic situation that the candidate cannot plan for. The specifics change every run. No 2 stage 7s are the same. Mara's stage 7 began at 800 on day 4. I'll describe what I witnessed from the gallery because I could not watch by this point. No one in the gallery could. The stage 7 environment is a crisis scenario. In Mara's run, it was presented as a damaged station with multiple simultaneous failure events, structural, environmental, life support, and an active external threat. Not a real station. A trial construct. But detailed enough, the trial architects told me later that the candidate's responses are physiologically and psychologically indistinguishable from their responses to a real situation. She had to navigate a collapsing structure, Stage 1 and Stage 3 skills, in variable atmospheric conditions, Stage 2, with a cognitive load of multiple simultaneous problems to solve, Stage 2 again, combatants to deal with, Stage 5, no reliable external information, Stage 4, and the Stage 7 element that draws on Stage 6, the ongoing presence of a scenario specifically designed to activate whatever the mirror had identified as her deepest uncertainty. I don't know what the Stage 6 profile had surfaced for her, but I could see, in Stage 7, the moments when it manifested. There were 2 or 3 points in the 4-hour scenario where she went very still in a way that was different from her tactical stillness, where something internal was happening that wasn't about the problem in front of her. And each time she moved through it, the stillness would last 15, 30, 40 seconds. Then something would shift, some decision, some recommitment I couldn't see or hear, and she'd be back in the problem. I don't know what those moments were. I have my theories, but they're hers, not mine. The Stage 7 scenario concluded at 12:23 on day 4. The trial architecture, the 40-meter steel monolith that had been Mara's entire world for 94 hours and 22 minutes, went to standby configuration. The lights shifted to completion mode. The trial system's output terminal in the assessment room displayed a single symbol, the Gareth Pass indicator, a green circular mark that I had seen display 41 times in 11 years of observation. 42 now. The ending. She came out of the trial architecture at 12:41. Not limping, though later I learned the ribs from Stage 5 had made the last day genuinely painful. Just walking, moving like a person who is exhausted past the point where it shows as drama. When you're that tired, the body simplifies. Everything unnecessary falls away. She walked through the exit corridor and into the transition hall, and she stopped. Thesson Vore was there. He'd come down from the observation deck, something he told me he'd never done before for a candidate exit. Several of the other observers were there. The intake staff, some of the trial architects. People had found reasons to be in the transition hall. There was a kind of charged silence, not uncomfortable, more like the silence before something is said that everyone in the room already knows. Thesson looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something I'd never seen him do. He brought his right hand, the Kreth formal acknowledgement gesture, the one they use for beings they recognize as equals, to the center of his chest, and held it there. "Specialist Voss," he said. She blinked at him. She was still in the early stages of reorienting to normal lighting, normal pressure, normal space. Still recalibrating to a world where up and down stayed in place. "You completed the Gareth qualification trial," he said. 94 hours and 22 minutes. Stage 7 conclusion at 12:23. She took a breath. "The completion rate for the Gareth trial across all species and all recorded runs," Thesson continued, "is 4.3%. You are the 42nd recorded pass in the trial's 300-year history. And you are," he paused, "a beat of something that might have been weight, might have been history. You are the first human." The room was very quiet. Mara looked at him, then she looked at the ground, then she looked back up. "Was it supposed to be that hard?" she said. Her voice was rough with hours of disuse. "Or is that just for humans?" Thesson made a sound that I would have said, from his species, was impossible, something low and resonant that his people make. I was told later, only in the presence of something genuinely surprising. "It is equally hard for everyone," he said. "That is the point." She nodded slowly, like she was filing the information. Then she reached into her pocket, the small pouch she'd carried in, the one personal item the trial allows, and she took out a folded piece of paper, just a piece of paper. She unfolded it. I don't know what was written on it. I was at the wrong angle to see. Whatever it was, she read it, refolded it carefully, and put it back in her pocket. "All right," she said, same words she'd been saying since day one. Quiet, addressed to no one, the sound of a private accounting being made. Then she looked at Thesson. "Is there food somewhere? That isn't coming out of a timed dispenser." The tension that had been building in the transition hall for the last several minutes broke in a way I hadn't quite anticipated. It didn't break into celebration, exactly, though there was some of that. It broke into the specific kind of release that happens when something has been held tightly for a long time and is suddenly allowed to be simple. Someone went to find food. I talked to Mara Voss later, in the observer debrief session that's standard after a trial completion. It's not long, maybe an hour. We ask candidates to walk us through their experience in their own words, to the degree they're comfortable. She was careful, not guarded. There's a difference. She answered what I asked. She thought about some questions before she answered them. She didn't perform anything. I asked her what the most difficult moment had been. Every candidate gets that question. Most give you stage 5 or stage 6 or some specific moment of physical extremity. She thought about it. "There was a point," she said, "around hour 60 in the long dark. I'd done all the math I could remember. I'd gone through everything I had stored up, and I ran out." She paused. "Not of endurance. I wasn't going to tap out. I knew that, but I ran out of the things I'd been using to fill the space. And it was just dark and quiet and nothing." "What did you do?" I asked. "I just stayed there," she said. "I let it be what it was. I stopped trying to fill it." She was quiet for a moment. "That was the hardest part," she said. "Not the darkness, just staying in it without needing it to be something else." I wrote that down. I think I'll be writing it down in various forms for the rest of my career. I asked her about stage 5, the maintenance coupling, the technical vulnerabilities, the arena tactics. She shrugged, which is a human gesture that I've learned to interpret as comfortable familiarity with a topic rather than dismissiveness. "I'm a systems specialist," she said. "I read manuals. I like manuals. They tell you where the off switch is." "You liked manuals," I said, "because I found I wanted to understand this. My grandmother used to say that if you want to know how something works, don't ask someone who uses it. Ask someone who has to fix it when it breaks." She paused. She was an engineer. She fixed a lot of things. I asked her, finally, the last question, the one I always ask, why she'd applied to the Gareth trial. She looked at the wall for a moment, then, "Because someone told me the completion rate for my species was 0, she said. And I wanted to understand whether that meant humans couldn't, or whether it meant humans hadn't yet." "And?" I said. She looked at me. "Hadn't yet," she said. The Gareth trial's administrative record was updated on the 4th day of the 3rd month of that year. Under species first completions, a new entry was added. Human Specialist Mara Voss, pass. Stage 7 conclusion, 12/23. The record also noted, in the administrative supplementary data field that most people never read, candidate breakpoint profile, unestablished, system unable to identify fixed psychological fault lines, adaptive matrix defaulted to maximum difficulty parameters across all stages, candidate passed on first attempt. The trial architects, I'm told, spent 6 weeks arguing about what this meant, whether the system had a flaw, whether Mara's profile represented a genuine anomaly or a data artifact, whether they needed to recalibrate the intake assessment for human candidates. In the end, they added a note to the system documentation. Human candidates, intake assessment unreliable for breakpoint profile generation. Reason, insufficient data baseline. Note for future reference, human psychological resilience architecture appears to have variable fault line structure that does not conform to species standard profiling parameters. Further research required. Which is a very long technical way of saying They couldn't figure out how to break her. Not because she wasn't breakable, but because whatever was load-bearing in her kept moving, kept shifting, redistributing, adapting, in a way their system had been built to track in fixed, species-standard patterns. They hadn't encountered anything like it. They hadn't been looking for it. I have observed 42 Gareth trial completions in 11 years. 42 moments where a being walked out of that 40-meter architecture, having done something that 95.7% of all candidates cannot do. Each one was significant, each one was earned. But I remember Mara Voss differently than the others, not because she was more impressive in the ways the trial measures. Her times were not record-breaking across most stages. Her combat performance was unconventional at best. She won no category records except the Stage 2 puzzle. I remember her because of the quality of her persistence. It wasn't spectacular. It wasn't the kind of persistence that looks like heroism from the outside, the dramatic push, the visible triumph of will over circumstance. It was quieter than that, more functional, more practical. She kept moving because stopping didn't fit her understanding of the situation. She adapted because she'd already accepted that things were going to be different from what she expected. She solved problems with the tools she actually had rather than the ones the situation suggested she should have. And when she ran out of things to fill the dark with, she stayed in the dark anyway. I think about that last one a lot. Because most of us, most beings of every species, spend enormous energy trying to make the difficult moments into something other than what they are. We fill the silence, light the darkness, substitute narrative for experience. We make the hard thing bearable by making it into something slightly different. Mara Voss at hour 60 of the long dark ran out of ways to do that, and she stayed anyway. Not because she was beyond fear, or beyond doubt, or beyond the desire to be somewhere warmer and brighter and less completely alone, but because she'd decided, somewhere along the way, maybe before the trial, maybe in the preparation chamber watching the architecture rise above her, maybe at some point during the 72 hours of darkness, that the hardest version of reality was still reality, that you could be in it without it consuming you, that the distance between what is and what you wish were true could be acknowledged rather than fought, and that acknowledgement, paradoxical as it seems, was the thing that left her resources intact for the next problem. I don't know how you learn that. I'm not sure it's something you learn so much as something you arrive at, through some combination of circumstance and character, and the specific shape of your particular life. Mara Voss had arrived at it. And she carried it through 94 hours and 22 minutes of the hardest trial that 300 years of galactic military science had ever designed. And when she came out the other side, her first request was for food that wasn't on a timer. She's stationed at the 7th Deployment Initiative now. I see her records occasionally. The observer role comes with certain access. She's listed as a senior systems specialist, field operations. There are some commendations, a few citations I don't have clearance to read the details of. There's a small note in her service file, visible to personnel with observer access, that just says, Gareth Certified, Trial Run Reference 42. I've heard that she keeps the piece of paper in her pocket still, the one she read in the transition hall. I don't know what it says. I think about it sometimes, in the way you think about things that feel significant without being able to fully articulate why. I imagine it's something practical, something her grandmother said, maybe, or a list of what she knew to be true about herself, something that kept her company in the dark when the math ran out and the stored words were spent, and it was just her and the silence and the honest fact of what she was trying to do. Something that reminded her, this is real and you are here and the door is at the other end. Whatever it was enough. That's the thing about the 4.3%. It's not that they don't break. They do, in small ways, in the moments you don't see, the private stillnesses, the floor staring in the transition corridors, the short sound in the observation chamber that was not quite a laugh. The 4.3% break, they just don't stay broken. They pick up the pieces with whatever's left, look at the next door and say, okay. And they walk through.